Okay, alright, let's do it. What's up, everybody? D-Man back. Welcome to a brand new video, and today we're going to be reviewing Skull Island Season 1, Episode 7, You're Not a King, You're Just a Stupid Animal. I understand why this is the fan favorite of the show. I've been told ever since the show came out that this was going to be my favorite episode. I finally got to see it, and now I understand why. Alright, let's get into it. Alright, so episode 7, You're Not a King, You're Just a Stupid Animal, is pretty much entirely told from Kong's point of view. That's why this is the fan favorite. This is the first MonsterVerse thing that has focused 100%, the main character is the Titan, this being Kong. Obviously, Kong is a character we have proven time and time again since 1933 that he can carry a film and carry a story on his own. This is just the culmination of that. I understand why this is the fan favorite episode, but I have to say, do you guys remember that one comment I mentioned many videos ago? That one comment rattling around that's been in my brain and I didn't need it in there. That one that I was like, I wish I never read that comment. The one that said, the way I feel about this show is how you feel about Godzilla Awakening. I think I get it. I think I understand why. Because although I thought this was a great episode, I thought it was a fantastic story, I thought as an isolated episode, this episode was incredible. It makes me question why this show is in the MonsterVerse. One thing I will say is that I appreciate that this show is more consistent with the MonsterVerse that we know than, say, the Pacific Rim anime was to Pacific Rim when it went, let's throw Pacific Rim out the window. What if we did our own thing? And none of that mattered. But then they build it as if it was like going to be a continuation of that story, and it just wasn't at all. This is, I would say, definitively a continuation of the MonsterVerse story, but whereas that Pacific Rim anime felt like 20 steps removed from the Pacific Rim movies, this Skull Island anime feels like 1 or 2 steps removed from the MonsterVerse. I would say, like, if the comic books feel 1 step removed from the movies, this show feels another step removed from the comics, which makes it 2 steps away from the MonsterVerse. That's kind of how I feel about this episode. Because while I did enjoy it, I have a lot of issues with it. Particularly, my biggest issue for this episode is that this episode takes place at the wrong time. Now, if this episode had been set anywhere from 20 to 100 years before the events of Kong Skull Island, nothing, not one thing in this episode would have to change except one single line of dialogue. One line of dialogue would have to change. Then we would be better set. The way that this operates now is okay, we'll all go through it. I'll work through the episode with everybody the same way I always do. I have a lot more notes this time than normal because obviously this was a jam-packed episode. It was great. There's so much to bite into, so many incredible little Easter eggs and details that I want to talk about. So I'll go through the episode, but again, I'm going to be talking about how, although I loved it, I don't know if I love it as part of the MonsterVerse. Time will tell. Obviously, I'm somebody who takes canon consistency very seriously when it comes to this stuff. So a lot of the times I'll be throwing a curveball, like having, I don't know, Godzilla and Kong stand on a boat and it doesn't sink, and then I'll have to give it a couple years and then I go, all right, I'm on board, whatever, it can happen. So I'm sure at some point I'll settle into the fact that, all right, we're rolling with it. This is just how it is. But it's going to take more than just this show. It's going to take acknowledgement of the events of this show in one of the movies for me to finally feel like that this show truthfully is part of the MonsterVerse, because it does feel, like I said, 2 steps removed. It feels like, okay, this takes place in a parallel dimension. Again, I'm going to need a movie to acknowledge the events of this show for me to feel like it has been set in stone. And I don't know if that's going to happen, at least not with Godzilla x Kong: The New Empire. I don't think that movie's going to touch on any of this stuff. In fact, that movie has some issues that will directly contradict some of the stuff in this show, and I definitely plan on making a video about that when some of those details from Godzilla x Kong kind of come to the public a little bit more. Spoiler warning for Season 1, Episode 7 of Skull Island anime, You're Not a King, You're Just a Stupid Animal. Spoilers for that. I'm not going to be doing a plot plot by plot, beat by beat, but I am going to be giving my notes as I watched the episode. All right, jumping into it. Starting out, I really loved the cinema aspect ratio. It's something that we've had for all the flashbacks in this show, but personally, I just think it looked a little prettier. I guess I've just been accustomed to that by being a film student, but I don't traditionally always love the cinema aspect ratio, but I do think it looks really nice in this episode. I also loved the Skullcrawler design. It has such an incredible redesign, so great. It looked incredibly fluid. I loved it, and it was a great way to tie this into the MonsterVerse. One thing I will say with it though is I could not tell how big it was supposed to be. She has the spines and the back of the Ramarak, the giant skullcrawler from the end of Kong Skull Island, but she seems small enough to be like the normal sized skullcrawlers that attacked the Boneyard when compared to that native. However, when Kong airdrops on it and kills it in a very fast fight, by the way, just showing how much Kong has evolved as a fighter since then. Great stuff. When he drops in on him, he's like not as big as you'd think he would be compared to it, which makes me think this was supposed to be kind of the size of the big one. Now, I knew from the start that this was not the same native as the other episodes because the second she ran onto screen, she does not have the tattoos on her arm that she needs to. I actually noticed that while editing the other video where I mentioned that I thought that it was the same native. I noticed while editing that video that she was not wearing the iwi tattoos, meaning this is not an iwi, and sure enough it isn't. I'm shocked that the Skullcrawler didn't just snatch up that native with its tongue and eat her up. That seems like a very Skullcrawler thing to do. I guess this one was just being patient because the plot asked it to. I don't know where Kong found that tree branch that he uses to kill this thing with. I think that's a tree branch. It's kind of golden colored, so I couldn't quite tell, but I think it's a tree branch. That thing is so strong, it could pierce straight through a Skullcrawler's armored plated head. I loved the fatality, very brutal, but I would have preferred it to be a rock and not a stick because I feel like a tree branch would have broken. Hi, welcome to the standing version of this desk. I'll also mention now that, yeah, Kong using the tree against the Skullcrawler is a reference to the fact that one time Kong used the tree against the Skullcrawler. So more Easter eggs for ya. But it was a great scene, great Kong introduction. I loved that whole moment. It looked great. Shots were great. It was really good stuff. So this is the first time the MonsterVerse Kong has picked somebody up officially in the capacity that his other Kong counterparts have. Of course, Kong has really only held Weaver in the MonsterVerse up to date. That's the only human he's held in the MonsterVerse so far on screen. Maybe he does in the comic books, I can't remember. But on screen, it's the only human he's held so far, and he holds her in the palm of his hand. He doesn't hold her like this. So it's fun to see Kong actually hold a woman in the way that the other Kongs do. I also love how sassy he is and how this Kong is clearly like, oof, I don't like picking people up. He's above it. I like that he doesn't want to pick her up. I think that's fun. He is drawn way closer to his Kong Skull Island height throughout this whole episode. Sometimes he's way smaller than that. Sometimes he's definitely like the 50-foot Kong. And sometimes he's drawn like he's the appropriate 200-ish feet that he should be. But for the most part, they do draw him at about 100 feet, I would say, compared to that girl. Yeah, okay, it's a flashback episode, so maybe that makes sense. Maybe. I don't know how big he should be then. Like maybe 150-ish feet? I don't know. But maybe it checks out. Maybe. There's another little King Kong detail for you here in this scene as the girl rides on Kong's shoulder in a very similar way to the way that Dwan rides up Kong's shoulder as he climbs the Twin Towers. The relationship with this native mirrors Kong's relationship with Gia, although this one is way more developed. It seems like this is where that relationship with Gia is headed if they have enough time to spend together. I think it kind of weakens the Gia relationship personally. I'm not 100% sold on this relationship with this native girl because the whole thing that made Kong's relationship with Gia so strong is that the two of them could communicate together. Kong doesn't necessarily understand verbal communication, but he does understand sign language. That's what made their connection so strong. That's what gave them such a powerful bond, and they have erased that now. Now it turns out all you had to do was speak Spanish, because apparently Kong speaks Spanish perfectly. Don't know what's up with that, so I didn't love that. I'm not personally a fan of that. I think that it weakens the relationship with Gia, makes it less special. I like that Kong climbs this mountain. Again, it's another Kong Skull Island moment. Kong's headed up a mountain. That's good stuff. We're going back to what we know. We're going back towards the MonsterVerse, but it's not the same mountain. It's not the same lookout that he sits on, which again makes me say it's 2 steps removed. He has a mountain, he has a sit out, but it's not the same spot. I will say I literally cheered out loud when the Aurora showed up. That's all I've ever wanted. That is all I've wanted in this show. That's all I've ever wanted. All right, I'm back on board with this episode, and it's the best thing that's ever happened. This is the best thing that's happened to the MonsterVerse since 2017's Kong Skull Island. I've just decided. I love that they added it back. It was almost like they heard me in my last review where I said, hey, the night sky is great and all, but where's that Aurora? And then they went, here it is. Good stuff, man. Thank you to the animators and the writers and everybody else. A lot of this episode kind of felt like somebody had heard some of my pitches for the MonsterVerse previously and taken them and ran with them in a bit different of a direction than I would have, but I appreciated that they were there. I think it's great that the Auroras were here, and it was such a beautiful visual. Speaking of the native, what is she? She speaks Spanish. She looks white. Is she like Spanish? Is she that kind of Spanish? I also know that Spanish is a language spoken in some of the Philippines region. Maybe she's from the Philippines because, again, Skull Island is supposed to be in the South Pacific. Now, that was something that confused me. She's not an Iwi, clearly, because she's not Asian. The Iwis are Asians. She's not. I would have preferred, personally, I think what they should have done is had her be a Vietnamese character. Then they would have stayed in line with Kong Skull Island by having her speak Viet. She'd still be speaking a different language. I think it would be far more interesting and far more in line with what we have seen so far if she was Vietnamese. But that's to say, what is she doing on this island? Is she shipwrecked? That's something that I really want to talk about. That's what I was alluding to earlier in this video. One of the issues that Godzilla vs. Kong has presented that they will be continuing to develop in Godzilla x Kong. The Iwi are supposed to be shipwrecked, so I like that she seems to be shipwrecked. Again, seems like they really are building on some of the concept art and other ideas that Jordan Vogt Roberts had for Kong Skull Island, and this seems to be one of those. So she is in fact from a different village, and she is in fact not an Iwi. I was wondering if they were looking at the Iwi village when they were setting up in the mountain because you see the lights in the distance. I thought that would have been phenomenal if that was the Iwi village. That'd be a great way to just reference the fact that they're on the island but not visit them personally. Of course, I do think that this is the village by the seashore that we see later in the episode. I think that this is the village that native is from. I don't think it's the Iwi village, but it would have been, I think, more interesting if it was the Iwi village. One of my biggest critiques about this episode is that this episode overly humanizes Kong, gives him way too deep of a human characterization. I've seen a lot of people say this movie is the best characterization Kong has ever gotten, and for me personally, that's still Godzilla vs. Kong. I think that's the gold standard for how to tell a story with Kong that humanizes him to an extent we've never seen before, gives him the ability to communicate with humans and understand humans on a basic level, but doesn't overdo anything. Kong can't fully understand every single thing a human says. He can listen, but mostly he's just following the sign language. He clearly understands sign language, and I liked that because it was still staying in the realm of realism where real life apes can understand sign language. They can't understand our verbal speech as well. So I appreciated that Godzilla vs. Kong was taking Kong in a direction where they were humanizing him, but also keeping him an animal. They were keeping him an animal and monstrous. I personally think Kong Skull Island has the more interesting depiction of Kong in the MonsterVerse as a noble god. I think that's far more interesting, but you also can't do as much with that, which is why I do think you needed to add those human elements in Godzilla vs. Kong, because that makes the character more applicable to wider sets of circumstances and lets you do more with him. But the Kong in this episode is taken so far that he actually reminds me of Kong from King Kong Lives, where for some reason the Kong from the 1976 film, which was also sort of portrayed as an animal slash god, but mostly an animal, all of a sudden was portrayed as just some dude. It was weird when they did that in that movie, and it's kind of weird that they're doing it here too. He's just a little too human for me. I would have preferred him to be a bit more monstrous. He understands more than Dog does. Dog seems to understand less than Kong does, and Dog seems to speak English perfectly. So I don't know. They're taking it a little bit too far. Again, 2 steps too far is how I feel about this whole episode. In a way, this episode would have worked perfectly if we said, well, this was removed. This was before Kong Skull Island. You know, his connections to this native, this is all before. The reason he winds up this kind of quiet, noble, sad guy that we meet in Kong Skull Island is because all of this has happened in his past. But that's not what we're being told. We're being told he went from being this sad, noble, quiet god to being this playful teenager to then being again another sad, less noble warrior that we meet in Godzilla vs. Kong. I don't understand the progression of Kong in this show. I think what they should have said is this episode was set before the events of Kong Skull Island. But it isn't, because really quickly into the episode, the native, who's never named by the way, mentions the people who came from the sky and their flying machines. I like how they refer to them as the flying people. people from the sky. Just going back to that Skull Island, the Birth of Kong lore. It's a real shame because, again, had this episode taken place before Kong Skull Island, Kong's character arc would make more sense. It makes less sense for this episode to be set when it does. Just rolling with the episode, now we're back to just rolling with it and accepting it. I think it's funny that Kong's into the idea of a Mechanic-Kong, like he clearly likes that idea, which makes me wonder how he felt when he met Mechagodzilla. I mean, maybe the reason he gets so angry when he sees Mechagodzilla, because he gets instantly angry at him, and you know, it could be because Gia tells him that that's a bad guy, but it also could be because it's reminding him of this native that he had this bond with. Beautiful, beautiful Aurora, great shot, I love it. Thank you, everybody involved in this show. We need more of that in the MonsterVerse, please. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Rest in peace, that hedgehog cat. I don't know what that thing's called. I forget. I think it's like a porcupine or a hedgehog. I think it'd make a great companion sidekick to Dog. You have Dog and then you get a cat to go along with it. But this guy dies. He deserved better. Rest in peace. Also, that confirms that Kong did eat Mustache. That confirms that the Phoenix takes people to Kong to eat. I saw somebody in my comments on one of the previous videos defending the action of eating a human, saying Kong has done it in the past, therefore is not morally ambiguous. I know you're going to watch this video because you watch all the videos. I'm not saying that it isn't something Kong has done in the past. Kong has eaten people as early as the 1933 film. Not my issue with it. I'm just saying it is morally questionable and not a real chill thing for Kong to do. He should know better. He knows people. He should know better than to eat people. MonsterVerse Kong isn't a people eater. The one guy he ate in Kong Skull Island was a total accident. He didn't mean to do that. This scene's got a lot of little Easter eggs going on as well. I mean, obviously the whole setup of putting things on a podium for Kong as a sacrifice is very clearly a tribute to the way that they did that in all the other movies. Although here he's eating them rather than just taking them away. However, it is implied in those other movies that maybe Kong was eating his tributes, or at least leaving them to die. So it still kind of carries a similar weight, I guess. And it just goes again to show that Kong's always hungry, always eating. So Kong's looking at this statue of himself, which reminds me a lot of that King Kong 2005 storybook, for those of you who remember that. It's also something he does in the Godzilla vs. Kong movie, looks at a statue of himself. But this whole temple thing, this whole reveal, this whole statue of Kong, and he's looking at a reflection of himself, it all just goes to weaken the impact of that incredible moment in Godzilla vs. Kong when he finds something of his own species. He finds the temple, the first thing he has ever encountered that truthfully represents where he comes from and what his lineage is, his past, his history, and he truly for the first time sees the mark of his own species. Now that impact is completely lost because it turns out he just lived in a temple just like that one, the head statues just like that one, and so this really isn't anything special to him. Good stuff here with Kong being lonely and wanting more of his kind. Looking at that statue sets up for Godzilla vs. Kong very well, but I'm surprised to see that this temple is already abandoned. I wonder what this place was. I'll talk a bit more about that towards the end of the video, but yeah, I wonder what this place is, and I wonder why this moat already exists around it, if not to keep skullcrawlers out. I wonder what's up with that. Kong totally gyras, or green gargantuas that native coming up out of the water under her when she's fishing, meaning that he can totally hold his breath and swim way better than we've ever realized in the MonsterVerse before, because he was stealthy enough to get underneath her without her noticing. I also like how Kong uses the Phoenix to see if something's wrong. It's like his scout. I think that's a really interesting use of those two together. Rest in peace, the Skur Buffalo. Is that how you say that? Skur? Scare? I don't know. Rest in peace, the Big Buffalo. I liked seeing that Kong Skull Island cameo. It was a good little nod to that movie. And again, just ties nicely with the lore of the MonsterVerse Skull Island. And again, it's a good way to tie back to that movie with Kong coming to the rescue of another one of those Skur Buffaloes. And maybe that's what gets him so upset about the whole situation, is that he just loves that type of animal. It's a big friend of his, something like that. So I appreciated it. I wonder why Kong has beef with these chameleons. I mean, are they not supposed to be part of the natural order? Isn't them killing animals kind of their gig? That's just what they do? I mean, is Kong's whole thing that he doesn't like things eating other things? Because then he partakes in eating other things as well. So I was wondering why he was having beef with them. I think it would have been more interesting if it was explained that they were supposed to stay in the caves under Skull Island, and then them being on the surface was an issue. You could easily have the natives say something like that. There's just something about the way Kong moves in this episode that is very reminiscent of King Kong from King Kong Lives. The way he runs on all fours, the way he expresses himself, the way he emotes. It just reminds me a lot of that King Kong. Those natives that Kong runs past, they're just like real soldiers, like normal soldiers. Seemed kind of out of place for Skull Island. They're not Iwis, so I'll give them the pass. Different culture and all, but it just seemed like they were a bit too advanced. Interesting new desert location here. I wonder where that is on the Skull Island map. Again, this show really needed to track where things were because it gets very confusing how there's so much terrain that we've never explored. Seeing Kong on a stakeout is kind of weird because it's a bit too human of a thing for him to do, but I think it's interesting seeing the way he strategizes. Reminds me of in Godzilla vs. Kong, the way he gets the high ground on Godzilla so that he can come up with a strategy to fight him. It's also fun to see that they return to a boneyard, much like in Kong Skull Island, in order to deal with these little critters. It was a bold choice to make Kong cocky and immature in this scene, rather than just animalistic and aggressive. I don't know why they had to humanize him to the extent they did. I think it would have been more compelling if Kong was animalistic and aggressive and still did all of the same actions while fighting these guys, just simply with different motivation, because as it stands, he kind of does it just because he's being defiant to that native. It makes him a little less sympathetic, considering this sets in motion the whole chain of events that leads to the entire civilization getting wiped out. Kong bringing that rock to the edge of the cliff is a very human thing for him to do. It's a very boys will be boys moment. Boys love dropping big rocks, so it's good to see Kong's one of the boys, although if you notice, there's a lot of blood down there. That blood will disappear in the rest of the fight scene, but that's just one of those little interesting animation errors that I think are fun to point out. Why does Kong struggle in this fight against a couple lizards so much? You'd think Kong would wipe the floor with these guys, but no, he really struggles with these guys. I don't quite understand. Fantastic tension through this scene. This scene is a masterfully done sequence, aside from the fact that Kong should hold his own better, and aside from the fact that I don't agree with the characterization of Kong being as amplified as it is. This sequence is masterfully done. It has incredible tension. It's got a great escalation as it goes. It is a super good scene. I really enjoyed the whole thing. Great stuff. Kong fighting with the bone was similar to how he fights with the tree in Kong Skull Island. He's also got pretty decent aim against this chameleon, even though it does dodge him. He does have really good aim, which again sets up for Godzilla vs. Kong when he does have surprisingly good aim when attacking Godzilla. The chameleon attacking the native and then the falcon rescuing her was an incredible sequence. I thought it was so good, and it reminded me a lot of Spider-Man No Way Home. That scene when Kong goes to catch her and she slips right past his finger, I was shocked. I really thought, oh my god, they're gonna kill her. How bold is that to kill her right after they've introduced her? And they basically do, but I felt that there was real stakes to this whole sequence. I thought it was really good. And that does go to say that there was a good bond between Kong and this native, that I was genuinely worried that she would die. That big chameleon's tongue reminds me a lot of Zetus from Gamera the Brave. I don't know if that was an intentional reference or if it's just the fact that they're both based on lizards. Could be. But I like to call everything a potential reference, so I'll call that a potential reference. I'm also interested in how smart is this Phoenix so that it knows to save her from falling. I mean, clearly Kong's got it well trained, but this thing has above the average bird's intelligence. Even on a Skull Island level, this thing seems a little smarter than any bird should. I loved the chameleon cloning Kong. That was great. I loved the way it also cloned his scars on its back. That was such a nice detail. And I love the way that Kong whipped that guy around, wiped the floor with him, completely warbatted him. Remember when he slams the warbat around? And then he took it a step further by Jason Xing that other pinned chameleon, which goes back to the warbat fight where Wingard's secret reference in Godzilla vs. Kong was that the warbat being used against the warbat was a reference to Jason X. And now here again we have Kong using a critter as a weapon against that same exact species. Good stuff, Kong. I like the consistency. Brutal kill on that one pinned chameleon as well. He just completely smushes it under that rock. Oh gosh, Kong is ruthless when he wants to kill something. The Phoenix does a Rodan in the air in order to shake off the chameleon. That's really cool. It does the same spin move. I liked that. And I cannot believe that the native survived that fall. I mean, yes, it does stick her to its tongue and then it hits the ground and then lets go and then she drops from there. But she still fell a billion feet. She was gonna die. I don't understand how she survived that. But I do like that the chameleon did, because it made them a lot scarier. It made you be like, oh god, they can survive getting stabbed. That's freaky. And again, it was a great way to escalate the stakes because now she was stuck on it while it was attacking her. Kind of reminded me of that whole scene. Remember that scene in King Kong 2005 when Anna's hiding and then she finds out that she's hiding right next to the V-Rex and then he goes to bite her? Or how about that scene when she's literally stuck hanging from the V-Rex's mouth and then it's chomping at her? Parallels, guys, parallels. They're everywhere. You just gotta look for them. I like that Kong takes battle damage in this episode, and I like that it stays on him throughout the episode. Good consistency there. Kong tail swings that chameleon in order to try and kill it, which is just what he does to Godzilla in the 1962 movie. And then Kong running from all these boulders reminds me a lot of that scene from Godzilla vs. Kong when the temple's caving in on itself. I don't know if that's a reference or not, probably not, but I figured I'd mention it anyways. It's also nice to see that there's consequences for Kong's actions, like because he's so large he can trigger a rock slide at any moment. I liked that. That scene when Kong Kong climbs up over the mountain and his hand comes up and slams down. I mean, that's straight from the beginning of Kong Skull Island. They do a lot of parallel shots in this show. Like the fan blades in episode 2 is a very similar shot to in Kong Skull Island, the movie. So they do a lot of parallel shots in this show. And I appreciate that this is one of them. That's a cool one to parallel. They also parallel that shot in Godzilla vs. Kong when Kong's getting out of the water onto the boat. The native wanting down, she's screaming and pounding Kong, and she's saying the same dialogue as Dwan from the 76 movie wanting to be put down. It's a very similar scene. It's a very similar shot as well to when Dwan wanted out of Kong's hand. I think it's fun that she calls that thing a hawk, so I guess now we have a species identified. That thing is similar to a hawk. Oh my god, she is so rude to Kong. He has every right to be upset with her, and she has every right to be upset with him, to be fair, because apparently my dude speaks Spanish perfectly. He 100% understood what she was saying and decided to go against her. It also makes me question, earlier she was like, let's go get the others and come up with a strategy. You're telling me Kong works with humans and strategizes with them? What are we doing here, guys? You can take him a step back, please. He's not supposed to be this cooperative. He's not supposed to be this smart. He's an animal. A big one, but he's an animal. Don't ruin his arc in Godzilla vs. Kong by making him more progressed now than he will be in the future. Now he's just taking a step back later. What? I liked when she roars back at Kong. It reminded me of Madison roaring back at Ghidorah, or even to a smaller degree, Kong roaring back at Godzilla in Godzilla vs. Kong. I also like the way that the hawk rides Kong's arm. That is very fun stuff. It's a little out of place for the MonsterVerse, but hey, everything in this episode is. So I'll just say it was cool. I liked it. It was a fun visual. Just shows that Kong trained that bird really well. I don't know how he did it, but he did. There's a scene during that sequence when Kong is slamming one of the lizards against a rock and his breathing sounds just like the King Kong from 1962. That was really neat. I don't know if that was an intentional reference, but it sounded a lot like 1962's Kong. So Kong healing with the water on his shoulder, that reminded me a lot of Kong Skull Island when he's healing his hand from all the wounds. He also sounds like the 1976 King Kong in this sequence. And the blood was so great. That was such a good scene. The way that the blood slowly comes down. It's got this super ominous, spooky music that obviously we recognize as the motif of the Kraken. Good stuff. It's a really, really cool way to build this rivalry. It does, however, unfortunately place the eradication of this advanced civilization on Kong. He is the one who directly caused them to die. Very sad, very tragic, and again, it makes Kong being immature earlier in the episode a little unsympathetic. It also, again, makes me think, hey, well, this would make sense if he was gonna mature for his next appearance, being Kong Skull Island, when he's a little more reserved and mature and doesn't interact with the Iwis because he probably doesn't want to hurt them the way that he hurt these natives. But no, that happened first. Why did that happen first? Kong growling from sympathy up from the top of that mountain was a very King Kong Lives thing for him to do. That was a very King Kong Lives moment. Remember that moment in King Kong Lives when he's all pretending to be hurt so that Lady Kong will come take care of him? Reminded me a lot of that. Kong coming over the wall was a nice classic King Kong visual. It also pays off some of the concept art from Kong Skull Island. I like the way that Kong tries to hand them a fruit tree and he's just trying to be helpful. It's very much like an animated King Kong thing for him to cause trouble by accidentally doing that. That came right out of the King Kong animated series right there. He's also brown in this scene. What the hell? Why is he brown in this scene? Because of the lighting of the sun. Hey, he should be brown the whole show though. I like that Kong can sense something is wrong, like he can tell something's in the water, but he doesn't quite understand it. Whereas Godzilla has a bit stronger of a sense for when things go awry, and Godzilla would have immediately known what was up. I like that Kong is still kind of like, well, something's going on over there. He can sense the threat, but he doesn't quite know what it means. One thing I do really like is this new village. I think it's got a great design. It kind of fits within the Skull Island aesthetic, reminds me of some of the stuff from the concept art book, and I think it's overall unique enough from the Iwi village to stand on its own as a new culture. I also like how it's on the beach side, how it's right next to the beach, how they've got a wall separating them from the rest of the island, showing how they could stay so isolated, and it reminds me a lot of the natives from the previous King Kong franchise. This is very much like the natives from the 33 film who lived right on the beach with the wall separating them from the island, so I like it. It's kind of a similar setup. This murder at sea felt very Jaws / War of the Gargantuas to me. That was great. And I love Kong coming to the rescue. That was, again, was an awesome thing to see him doing, makes him very heroic. I loved having him respond to that scream as well. He hears his native girl scream and that's what gets him to go save them. That's just like King Kong 1933 when he goes to save Anne from the T-Rex. And it's just a very King Kong thing to do, trying to save his girl when he hears her scream. It also reminds me of when Kong rushed to save Weaver after she got knocked into the water in Kong Skull Island. This scene where he discovers the destroyed village and all the bodies is downright tragic and is handled so well. It really makes you feel for Kong. This is the best they handle him in this episode, still animalistic and yet human enough to show these emotions. I also love how he is clearly afraid of the Kraken and doesn't want to go near it. That was good stuff, man. And the close-up on the eye here of Kong reminded me of Kong Skull Island, except this time sad. The native's death is so sad and is really well done. I like how she reaches out to him in kind of a Gia-esque way with her finger up, but instead of touching her finger, which is what I thought he was going to do, he puts her up to his face so that she can touch his face like what Weaver does in Kong Skull Island. You also see Kong's glowing eyes from Kong Skull Island return in this scene, which was a nice touch. And I love the way he mourns her and he buries his face into his hand where she is. That's great. One thing I was curious about is how does he set that necklace up? Also, how did he take that necklace off? He's got enormous fingers. How did he get that thing so delicately put there? And how did he even get her off her neck in the first place? It was cool to see that her temple does have Iwi paintings though. It shows that this temple was an Iwi temple at some point. I like that. And you've got a great burial scene here when Kong buries her. That was such a good moment. See, it's this whole sequence towards the end of the episode with no dialogue that makes me think that this whole episode should have had no dialogue. It should have been another unspoken bond with Kong. And then so many of my issues with this episode would be resolved because Kong's character arc would no longer be regressing into Godzilla vs. Kong. He would be progressing into his relationship with Gia. Kong wouldn't have to understand human speak as well, which would make sense given what we know of the MonsterVerse Kong. It would make him a bit more mythical, and it would make this episode a lot more special. You don't even have that much dialogue in this episode in the first place, so you didn't have to have the dialogue that you had. Beautiful scene here at the end of the episode. The sunset, the colors, it's so pretty. It also does a really good job establishing Kong's relationship with his necklace and justifying why he has feelings towards this necklace in the first place. And then you get to the modern day where Charlie comes up with this crazy rude plan to kidnap the necklace so that Kong will chase after him. It's really convenient that Charlie showed up just in time to see Kong sit there with the necklace so that he knew to steal it. Plot convenience aside, Charlie, what an asshole you are. So rude. But clearly they're gonna ride Dog into that thing, they're gonna steal the necklace, and then Kong is gonna chase after Dog, right? Which does mean we're gonna have to see how they get over there. I guess they're just gonna be able to run over that bridge, which they shouldn't be able to, but if they run over that bridge, what I'll say is that bridge should have been a big fallen log. That way Kong could twist the log and knock the people off the way that King Kong would. Yeah, that's my thoughts on the episode. I feel a little bad because I know that this is the fan favorite episode, and I feel like I have a lot more critiques for this episode than I normally do, and it's because, again, as a piece of King Kong media over here, so good, so good. I get it. It's a great episode. Great King Kong story. So many great emotional beats. Had a really nice plot. A nice character arc for Kong. It was a really well-structured, well-paced episode that had a lot of progression, emotion, heart. But it just didn't fit with the MonsterVerse over here. The MonsterVerse over here, it just that they don't fit together very well at all. So I don't want to say I agree with that comment. That one comment that casts the shadow over this whole show for me. I don't want to say I agree with it. I don't feel the way about this show that I feel about Godzilla Awakening. Godzilla Awakening, I'd say, is more like 7 steps, 10 steps removed from Godzilla 2014, and especially from the rest of the MonsterVerse. Wow, that comic has so little to do with the MonsterVerse and creates so many logistical errors. This doesn't. It just doesn't fit nicely. You can force them together and we can pretend that they work, which is what we'll do. But in reality, we forced 2 pieces together that shouldn't fit together. That's how I feel about this episode. It was a great episode. It really was great. It just wasn't the MonsterVerse enough. The thing that frustrates me so much is that for me, the issues are so simple to fix. Number 1, set this before Kong Skull Island so that Kong's character arc makes more sense, why he winds up sad and mopey in Kong Skull Island, why he winds up more reserved in that movie, why he doesn't interact with the natives as much. It also makes sense why he's more mature in that movie, why he is more defensive in that movie, why he's more aggressive in that movie. Number 2, strike out most of the dialogue, if not all of the dialogue. Just have Kong not understand her. You could have all of the same dialogue and just Kong doesn't understand her. He only understands her gestures. That's a super, super easy fix. And number 3, take Kong back like 1 or 2 steps. Get rid of some of the human emotion that he shows. Make him a bit more mythical and mystical. 3 simple things that they could have done to save this episode. It's not a bad episode, but it was disappointing that it was held back by such simple things is what disappointed me. That was a super long review. My recording here is 40 minutes long for an episode that is 20 minutes long. Classic D-Man right there. Thank you all for sitting with me through this one. If you want to continue supporting the channel, you can through the Patreon. I'm going to give a huge shout out to my patrons over on Patreon. Thank you guys so much for supporting the channel. If you want to support the channel, you can use the link in the description below where you can get early access to content content, access to the Discord community, and more. And I guess that'll do it for this one, guys. So I'm excited to see the finale. I hope the finale portrays the Kong of the MonsterVerse a little more than the Kong of this episode. I'm sorry that I don't share the enthusiasm and the portrayal of Kong in this as much as a lot of people do. Personally, my peak Kong is still Kong from Godzilla vs. Kong, then not barely under him is Kong from Kong Skull Island, and then just a little under that is King Kong 2005. That's my rankings of Kong characterizations. This falls more in the middle lower end. Probably this falls around the 76 Kong, somewhere in that category of the middle tiers. They all get kind of jumbled up. I don't really have my Kong characterizations ranked past the top 3, but they all get jumbled up somewhere in there. He would be somewhere in there. I think he's good. I just think he was out of place. All right. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I'll see you guys next time for the next one. D-Man out.